Ireland was the first foreign shore where English adventurers landed with the aim of conquest in the mid-12th century. The Emerald Isle would prove infuriatingly unruly and their people almost impossible to govern. Battles, blood feuds, wars, and rebellions raged almost constantly for 8 centuries as the would-be conquerors and independently minded native populace fought for supremacy. Less well known than the conquest of 1066, the invasion of Ireland is arguably more important as it was from their experiences in subduing the islands that the British Imperial war machine learns the lessons that would see them conquer the largest empire that the world has ever seen. Number 10. The invaders were invited to go to Ireland. Ireland was not one country in the 12th century, but was made up of around 150 kingdoms. Each king vied for military supremacy over his neighbours, and the most powerful of them then fought to be recognised as ruler of one of the 5 provincial territories. Just to confuse matters further, these provincial kings then contended to be recognised by his peers as the High King of Ireland. In 1166, the loser of one of these wars, Dermot MacMurrough, King of Leinster, was exiled from Ireland by the High King Rory O'Connor of Connacht. Dermot fled to France, where he begged assistance from King Henry II of England. Henry was unwilling to help. Dermot returned to England and was able to secure the employment of several Norman kings who would accompany Dermot back to Ireland and help him reclaim his throne. In return, Dermot promised to give these mercenaries 200,000 acres of land and lordship over the town of Wexford. Number 9. Most of the knights that went with Dermot to Ireland in 1169 were members of the same family. Amongst the first Norman men to agree to help Dermot MacMurrough was David Fitzgerald, the Bishop of St David's Cathedral in Wales. While his father had been one of the Norman invaders of Wales, his mother was a famous beauty named Princess Ness. She was the daughter of the last king of Deheubarth, a conquered Welsh kingdom. Bishop David's younger brother, Maurice Fitzgerald, and his 6 sons would all play leading roles in the invasion, as would Bishop David's own illegitimate son, Miles Fitzbishop. The bishop's other nephews, Mila Fitzhenry, Robert de Barry, and Walter de Rilsford, would also make their names in battle in Ireland. However, none of these bevy of kingsmen had the experience to lead the bishop's army. For that role, the bishop looked to his half-brother. But there was a small problem. Number 8. The leader of the Norman mercenaries was sprung from prison to take part in the invasion of 1169. In 1164, a Welsh chieftain, Rhys of Deheubarth, launched an attack on the Norman-held province of Ceredigion in Wales. Abertavy Castle was held by a famous knight called Robert Fitzstephen. He was another son of Princess Nest and a half-brother of Bishop David of St David's. Facing annihilation by the Welsh army, Fitzstephen's knights betrayed him, opening the gates of the castle to Rhys and allowing their captain to be captured. He would spend the next 3 years in a Welsh dungeon. During this time, Rhys, who was Fitzstephen's maternal first cousin, tried to convince him to abandon his loyalty to the King of England and help him free Wales from the Norman invaders. Fitzstephen he refused. Languishing in confinement, Fitzstephen's brothers finally were able to free him by promising Rhys that he would not stay in Wales and fight him, but would travel to Ireland with Dermot MacMurrough and settle on the lands that he would conquer there. Number 7. The invasion army was tiny. Far from being a vast, overpowering invasion by thousands of knights led by the King of England, the invasion of Ireland was initially conducted by just 400 men. Thanks to the recollections of Giraldus Cambrensis, a Norman monk working in 1185, and yes, another kingsman of the invaders, we know that the first expedition under Robert Fitzstephen in May of 1169 had only 50 of what we would recognize as knights today. The rest of his motley bands were made up of apprentice knights and esquires, infantry, as well as archers. Though not a very big army by the standards of the day, all had grown up as professional soldiers with the feudal system and were veterans of the Welsh conflict. Conversely, those they would face were principally farmers or tradesmen who could not replicate the Normans' disciplined tactics and strategies. It was this edge, rather than the superiority of numbers, that would allow Fitzstephen to carry the day in battle and help Dermot retake his throne. The second expedition to Ireland under Raymond de Carew, yet another nephew of Bishop David's, landed in May of 1170 with just 120 men. They were attacked by an army of between 2,000 and 4,000 Vikings from Waterford City. Despite being outnumbered by at least 20 to 1, it was the Normans who were able to emerge victorious at the Battle of Bagenburn. Number 6. The Normans initially fought against the Vikings rather than the Irish. In the 8th century, Ireland, like England, was subject to a series of raids by Vikings from Scandinavia. Soon the raiders had begun founding forts where they could settle and trade commodities such as animal skins and slaves. Many of these grew to be major port cities and included some of the country's biggest cities like Dublin, Waterford, Wexford, Cork, and Limerick. The people of these towns called themselves Ostmen, Eastmen, and intermarried with the native Irish over the ensuing 3 centuries. As a consequence, they became embroiled in the politics and infighting amongst the many nations of Ireland, but remained somewhat distinct from the Gael. Alongside the King of Leinster, Dermot MacMurrough, Robert Fitzstephen captured the Ostmen town of Wexford in 1169, while his nephew, Raymond of Carew, fought Ireland's version of the Battle of Hastings at Bag and Bun against the Vikings of Waterford in 1170. Raymond served the famous Baron Strongbow, and together they captured Waterford and Dublin from the Ostmen. In 1171, they also defeated an alliance of Viking chieftains from Orkney, the Hebrides, and the Isle of Man who wanted to recapture Dublin. Number 5. The most famous name to emerge from the invasion was Strongbow, but he was never actually called that name. The third expedition to Ireland landed at Passage East in County Waterford on the 23rd of August 1170 with 1,200 men in around a dozen ships. They were led by a knight called Richard de Clare. He was Lord of Chepstow Castle in Wales and was a great baron with a noble lineage equal to that of King Henry II. Today, Richard de Clare is known by the daunting sobriquet of Strongbow, and there is even a well-known cider that shares his name in recognition of Richard's great deeds. However, it is now believed that he was never known by that name and that it only became attached to him due to mistranslation of a Latin document. In the 12th century, Chepstow, where Richard de Clare had his principal residence, was at the centre of a lordship known as Strigwyl. This name probably derives from a Welsh word meaning a bend in the river, but was misidentified by a researcher as the nickname Strongbow in the centuries following the conquest. Number 4. The King of England tried to prevent the invasion from happening. Richard de Clare and King Henry II did not get on. Richard had backed a rival for the throne in 1154 and had lost the earldom of Pembroke as a result of Henry's victory. By 1170, Richard was suffering from severe financial hardship due to his banishment from the royal court. That was when Dermot MacMurrough, the King of Leinster, came to him asking for his help to claim the High Kingship of Ireland. Richard agreed as long as Dermot promised to give him his daughter in marriage and to make him heir to his kingdom. Henry, already embroiled in a war against King Louis of France and an argument with the Archbishop of Canterbury, Thomas Becket, considered the idea of Richard de Clare as king in Ireland with horror and had his government place a ban on him leaving Wales. Richard ignored the command and within a month of landing in Ireland in August of 1170 had captured the island's 2 largest cities, Waterford and Dublin, and had married Dermot's daughter. Furious, Henry decided to up the ante, imposing trade and travel restrictions on Ireland and warning that any Norman warrior that had not returned to Wales by Easter of 1171 would face outlawry and forfeiture of their lands. When this also proved ineffective in stopping the conquest, King Henry declared his own intent to raise an army and cross the Irish Sea to force Richard's submission. However, there was another reason for the invasion. Number 3. The murder of Archbishop Thomas Becket led to the King of England's direct involvement in Ireland. Amongst the most infamous deeds of King Henry II, and the one for which he is best known, is his part in the murder of Thomas Becket, the Archbishop of Canterbury, in December of 1170. What is less well known is that this act led directly to England's direct involvement in Irish affairs. All Christendom was affronted when 4 of Henry's knights killed Becket before the high altar of England's most holy site. Everyone expected the most severe punishment to be doled out by the Pope. Excommunication and interdict over his lands would mean that no subjects of the crown could receive communion, and thus their souls were put at risk. To the medieval mind, there was no greater penalty. Henry realized that if the Pope's representatives could not find him, they could not pass sentence, and so he crossed from France to England, ordering all of the ports shut, and then proceeded into Wales with his army. On the 17th of October 1171, Henry landed in County Waterford with over 4,000 men and toured the country, accepting the submission and surrender of all the Norman barons and Gaelic kings. Keeping Dublin, Waterford, and Wexford for himself, King Henry then began granting out portions of Ireland to his followers. He also made sure to bring about reforms in the Celtic Church, bringing them into line with the Catholic Church in Rome, including the methods by which the Irish would begin sending their tithes to Rome for the first time. It was this act, in addition to an act of public contrition, that saw the Pope forgive Henry of the murder of Becket and grant him lordship over Ireland. Number 2. The Celtic Church decreed that the Norman invasion was God's judgment on the Irish for the ungodly practice of slavery. Until the arrival of the Normans in 1169, Ireland was a slave state. Almost every facet of life relied upon or was influenced by the practice. Dublin was well known as one of the largest slave markets in Europe, and many of those unfortunates who ended up as slaves came from England and Wales. However, starting soon after the conquest of England, the Normans began to end the practice, freeing the slaves and granting them small portions of land as serfs. Quite why this happened is not fully understood. It may have been due to the influence of the church and their abhorrence of slavery, or it may have just been for practical purposes. A slave requires feeding, clothing, housing, and protection, while a serf is expected to provide all of these things for himself. A serf is also obliged to farm the land and give over most of his produce to his lord, keeping only part back for himself and his family. The Celtic Church, still reeling from the destruction of the Norman invasion, tried to make sense of what had happened, and at a meeting in 1171 decreed that the Normans were God's instrument for showing the Irish the wickedness of their ways, particularly for the cruel practice of enslaving his fellow man. Number 1. At several points during the invasion, it seemed very likely that the Irish would defeat the Normans and send them back to England. There was no point when the Norman invasion of Ireland looked secure. Even 400 years later, during the reign of Queen Elizabeth I, the government couldn't really be sure that their laws would be respected, even 20 miles from the walls of Dublin. The rest of Ireland was beyond the pale, as the famous idiom goes. But the invasion itself, it was balanced on a knife edge, and it relied on several strokes of good fortune to give the Normans victory in battle. At the Battle of Baggenburn in 1170, a chance stampede by a herd of cattle disrupted the Waterford Vikings and allowed Raymond de Carew to win. Raymond was reputedly only able to find a way into Dublin that same year because part of the defences were set on fire by a lightning strike. In 1171, an alliance of Vikings were too impatient to await the arrival of their ally, the High King of Ireland, and attacked Dublin without his help, only to be utterly routed. And even when the High King had the Normans surrounded, starving and outnumbered, they somehow managed to defeat him, launching a surprise sortie from the city while he was swimming and enjoying the summer sunshine. The last High King of Ireland was forced to run from the invaders, naked as the day he was born. The Irish and Osman could not match the Normans in warfare, but they did have something far more irresistible: an ancient and superior culture. By 1366, the English government produced laws decreeing that the descendants of the Norman invaders had to arrest their descent into barbarism and again follow English practices rather than those of the Irish. 200 years after their conquest, the Normans had already become more Irish than the Irish themselves. So this video was actually written by a guest author, Ruar Butler. He's a novelist who has written 3 historical fiction novels charting the turbulent years of the Norman invasion of Ireland. You can find him at Ruar Butler, that's ruadhbutler.com, or on Facebook at Ruar Butler. And as always, thank you for watching.